Welcome, creatures. Today is Wednesday, and just like yesterday, we checked our last update on the situation in Mythic Plus for Season 1. Today, we are going to be doing the same thing in the raid as well. Since we are about a week away from the end of Season 1, the beginning of patch 10.1 as well, we are checking for the last time how things are in the raid. Now, what's important and interesting this time around in the raid is that since the last time we checked this, we have gotten one round of balance tuning. For example, we have gotten Unholy Death Knight getting buffed. A couple of weeks ago, we have gotten Balance Druid being buffed. We have gotten Beast Mastery and Survival nerfed. We have gotten buffs to Discipline Priests, as well as nerfs to Restoration Shaman. So it's been a couple of weeks since then. We can now update how things have been in the raid, of course, in preparation for the release of the next season, trying to see and gauge perhaps what is going to happen at the beginning of Season 2. Now, this is going to be a pretty funny comparison because this was the last time we looked at the situation in the raid, which was just before the reset of a couple of weeks ago. So right before the balance tuning that happened. And the situation was like this. Now, it's been 2 weeks. What has changed compared to last time? Well, the first thing that is quite noticeable is perhaps the first time ever that we see a full 360. We see a full turnaround where Unholy Death Knight, the freshly buffed Unholy Death Knight, went from last place in overall damage in the raid in Mythic difficulty to first place in overall damage of Mythic difficulty, just with this round of tuning from a couple of weeks ago. Unholy doing primarily damage with their pets, getting their Raise Dead buffed, their Army of the Dead buffed, their Gargoyle damage buffed has pushed them to be now the #1 overall damage dealing spec in the raid. Specs that were not changed by the balance tuning have not really seen that many significant changes. For example, the previous results saw specs like Subtlety, specs like Retribution Paladin, specs like Demonology Warlock, as well as Marksmanship Hunter or Arms Warriors towards the top, and they still are right now, just a week from the end of the season. Same goes towards the bottom. Toward the bottom, we mentioned multiple times we saw, for example, all of the mages, all of the druids, as well as both of the shaman specs, and this is still the same situation from a couple of weeks ago. So in that regard, we are not really seeing that many changes. So pretty much the main result that changes from the balance tuning when it comes to the DPS was the buffs given to Unholy. We're not seeing too much of a change from the nerfs given to Beast Mastery Hunter, which was towards the bottom half already, as well as the nerfs to Survival Hunter. Surprisingly enough, last time when I was pointing out the growth in popularity of Retribution Paladin, I mentioned, it's gonna be difficult for them to pass Havoc and Beast Mastery in popularity because those two are very widely played specs. But actually this week we did see Retribution Paladin being more popular in the raid than Havoc Demon Hunter, and they are now even close to Beast Mastery. So maybe they will get to top, they will get to end Season 1 as the #1 more popular spec in Mythic raiding, if this trend continues for just one more week. Another thing that is visible this time is from the healer's perspective, because this was what we had a couple of weeks ago. A couple of weeks ago we had the nerfs already of Preservation Evoker, which made them drop by quite a bit, and at the same time the buffs that Resto Shamans received over time made them by far the best of the healers in the raid. So in this gap, in this period that we haven't checked the raid, we have gotten a 5.5% healing nerf to all of the abilities of Resto Shaman, and at the same time we have gotten the revert, the partial revert of some of the nerfs to Preservation Evoker. So now the situation after those changes is that Preservation Evoker has once again gotten back up. Not quite to the top, because Holy Priest now is still slightly ahead, but definitely not like before, falling in the second to last place. So now, with the buffs to Evoker and the nerfs to Shaman, Preservation is temporarily above Restoration Shaman in terms of HPS in the raid at the moment. It is still though a very fought after spot when it comes to the popularity of healers. Look at that. Look at that top 4 of healers between 26 and 23,000 logs, all 4 of them, Resto Druid, Holy Priest, Resto Shaman, and Preservation Evoker. So it's a very, very fought after, very, very crowded position. And even Holy Paladin, it's actually at 18,000 logs, so it's quite popular as well. Really just the 2 outliers for being quite underplayed at the moment are Discipline and Mistweaver, way, way further down in terms of representation. You can better see here that from the start of the patch, Preservation was nerfed and therefore their output was quite weak. And then right there at the start of the buff on April 11th, they start rising, and then rising more, and then rising more, until they get to 2nd place in terms of healing. Now, you didn't see it in the results, but as you can see here, what also happened on April the 11th was the buffs to Discipline Priests. So it wasn't a major buff, it wasn't significant, but still, from April the 11th, from that round of balance tuning, Discipline Priest has now gotten much closer, right? The gap between Discipline and the rest was much larger before compared to what it is now. And of course, for maximum hilarity points, this is the graph over time of Unholy. Here is Unholy at the bottom, and then comes April the 11th, the buffs comes in, and Unholy spikes all the way to the top. Similarly, what you can also see are the 2 Hunter specs we mentioned being nerfed. Beast Mastery, who was already towards the bottom, and then Survival, which was middle of the pack, got nerfed on April the 11th and went on falling down, further down towards the proper bottom of the results. So that is how the specs are now going to be facing the release of the next season. At that point, what's going to be important, for example, is going to be the balance tuning of patch 10.1. We mentioned recently the last couple of rounds of balance tuning, where, for example, Devastation Evoker is being buffed, Shadow Priest, Balance Druid, we have all 3 Mage specs being buffed in 10.1, so those will be bound to bring some changes to the power of the specs, and then of course you also have the power that will change from the tier sets, from losing the power of your current tier sets and then gaining the power of your new tier set. That is what eventually is going to start changing the power level of all of these specs. Of course, you're going to be better off and have more chances to be strong in the next season if you start from the position of an Unholy Death Knight. Right now, freshly buffed, compared from starting to the position of a Survival Hunter, all the way down at the bottom. The last of the role that we haven't talked about is Tank. Well, Tank isn't being talked about because we still haven't gotten any changes, and we're not gonna get any major changes in terms of balance tuning in 10.1 either. So last time we looked at it, Prot Paladin was rising because it's the new meta spec in Mythic Plus, so way more tanks in the raid are also playing Paladin, and the situation is still the same now. Blood, DK, and Prot Paladin are now the top 2 tanks in the raid, which have now started to gap a little bit more Protection Warrior. That is still the position in which tanks are going to find themselves as 10.1 is going to be released just next week. We can now finish talking about the specs power just by showing actually the difference that there was between the overall damage that we pointed out before and the single target damage, the boss damage, especially because looking at the PTR of 10.1, looking at the fights in 10.1, many, if not most, of the bosses, especially the difficult ones, the hard ones, are going to be more or less purely single target. There are going to be quite a few fights in the top half, so presumably the more difficult ones, like Rashok, like Magmorax, like most of the Echo of Neltharion fight, even Zaskarn, who are going to be either full single target or almost completely single target. So single target damage is quite important, looks like, in the next raid, and these are the results we have right now for single target, which might be even better because, as you can see here, the power of Unholy Death Knight is even stronger compared to the overall damage of the bosses, which might include AoE boss fights like, for example, Council or, for example, Diurna. In here, the power of Unholy is still quite strong. So that is the situation in terms of power of the specs before we get into 10.1. we have now a general idea of what to expect as we start getting into Aberus when it opens in a couple of weeks. Of course, as mentioned, you have to take into account all the balance tuning that will come in 10.1. In a few days, we will have our recap right before the patch. We will be bundling together all of the expected changes to the specs in 10.1 to see how many of the specs are going to be affected by changes, if they are mostly nerfs or if they are mostly buffs for the new season. But for now, this is how the specs are performing in the raid in this last week of Season 1. And things can definitely change, okay? Don't be misled just by this set of power. For example, if you go and look at the PTR results, if you go and look at the fights that were being tested in the PTR, you can see specs compared to where they are now in the boss damage, for example. You can see on the PTR specs like Demo, which right now, for example, is completely average, middle of the pack, or even a spec like Devastation Evoker, which is actually all the way towards the bottom, currently being one of the stronger specs in the PTR in the raid. So there is room, okay, there is room for some surprises, there is room for some turnovers once 10.1 launches and we get access to the balance tuning affecting the specs, and then a few weeks later, depending on how lucky you are, to the tier set bonuses that will come in Season 2. But for today and for this last week of the raid in Season 1, this was all we had to check for the raid. We have, of course, still a few days left to go. We will be able to check a few more things right before the season launches, like, for example, what exactly is going to be coming out in 10.1, especially what is only going to be out in the first week and what will come after in the following week once the season actually launches, as well as mentioned, the compilation of the balance tuning that will come for 10.1 and the final look, the final review of all of the tier sets, assuming Blizzard will be done by now, having tuned the tier sets for all of the specs. So this is what awaits us in the next few days, but for now we are stopping here for the raid review. Now, in our goodbyes, as usual, we start by thanking the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel. You can still support in plenty free ways, like liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself, because this is what YouTube wants, apparently. And then you can also follow me over on Twitter, as well as following me over on my stream on Twitch. So, with these social unpleasantries out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I don't know if you have heard it, but I have actually been changing while I was saying my goodbyes, because I have to go out and shop for groceries before it closes in about 24 minutes. So I have to be fast.